Hello, how are
Hi,
you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Go ahead and as you get settled in, go ahead and put your rename yourself like you did last week.
Okay. I have many questions for you.
You can ask a couple now, and then you can save a couple for the end of class.
Okay. One that is a burning question for me is the Bible or the Hebrew Bible says we are created in God's image.
Yeah.
Does that make us as humans energy? Because, I mean, what um, I mean, I can't put a face to God. Is God considered energy in Judaism? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And because of that question, we're always asking both ways to think about that question. If we are created B'Tselem in the image of the divine, the unnameable, ineffable, what does that possibly mean for us? It could mean our human form. I'm actually reading a lovely book about Jewish environmentalism and this verse. And does this refer to only human beings or to all of creation? Is all of creation created in God's image? Is consciousness, aliveness, right? And so some folks think of it as soul, some folks think of it as aliveness, some folks think of it as creation. And I would say primarily Judaism kind of focuses in on the first piece, that soul piece, as possibly what that means, but other meanings seem to be also doable for other folks as well.
Well, the concept of soul, what exactly did you see that as? I see that as a form of energy because it's not something tangible you can grasp.
Yeah, I would say that that's fair. That you know, when I think about my soul's presence in my life, it is something almost indescribable, but it's there. And so, yeah, I would say a form of energy is one way to think about it, a form of consciousness, a form of aliveness. Ezra, I don't know, are you having some issues on your end? Are you breaking up a little bit?
My camera does that sometimes. I just have to like talk nicely to it and it'll pay attention to me.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and wire myself in just in case I can help make sure my connection is really good. So that should help me a little bit. Hi, Kate. Good to see you.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
Good.
So Janet's asking a couple questions just as we land. So Janet, did you have one more to offer up before the class gets started today?
Well, I do, but I wanted to have, before that, I wanted to just make an observation, if I may. And maybe this will change as the course goes forward. But I'm not a fan of the little breakout groups. I'd much rather talk to you, have questions answered by you. No offense to the people in my group, I don't know you, but I'm here looking for as much information as I can glean from somebody who knows, like you, Rabbi.
So thank you, Jen. It's a lovely thought. And so the way I want to think about that is we don't do breakouts every week. Like tonight, we're not going to do breakouts.
Okay.
But it is a way to build community, right? So part of, as an educator, part of my educational vision for this group is to get a sense of, oh, this is a group of people that get to know each other a little bit. And in our getting to know each other, we can realize there's other folks in the group that are something like us, either an age or life experience. And oh, how can we begin to get a sense of who these people are? So I understand it can seem a little bit forced and a little bit, and for the folks who are here, it is also like a way for them to begin to connect. I've got two different families who are here, who are members, and they just moved to the community. They really want to just get a chance to meet everybody because they moved in a pandemic and we've been shut down. And so this is a way, right? So there's a lot of different needs here, and they're all great, right? So your needs are really important, and theirs, and we'll try and do a great job of hearing the needs and trying to. That's why I like to allow people to come in early to ask questions, stay late to ask questions, and that's where I kind of give my more one-on-one time.
Oh, great. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Janet. Hey, David Traub, good to see you. Hi, Aaron, welcome.
Thank you. Let me turn this off. Better lighting.
Yeah.
Are we in mute mode?
We can be allowed for the next few minutes. We'll go to mute when the class begins soon.
Okay.
I have a question about technical things. Maybe this is for Ezra. How do you know that your face is full screen or just a little corner over here? Because I don't want to be full screen.
Your screen does not reflect what anyone else sees. If you're making yourself full screen, that doesn't mean anyone else is going to see that full screen. So you don't have to worry about that.
Janet,
If you want, if you want to be seeing whoever is speaking and make sure their faces are full screen, you can go. If you move your cursor around, you'll see a little grid that says view. If you click on that and switch it to speaker, then whoever is talking will be full screen. If you switch it to gallery, then everyone gets to be little squares.
Okay, thank you.
Janet, the other user tip let me offer up is if you go to the three dots, you can also hide self-view, so you don't even get to see yourself.
Oh, good.
Because if you're in a meeting, right, why would you ever want to see yourself in a meeting? So there are ways to manipulate the screen so you see what you want to see and you don't see what you don't want to see. And that's always like a nice addition.
This is like a two-part class for me. Computer Learning 101 and Judaism 101. This is great.
That's great. Hi, Cheryl. Welcome. Good to see you.
May I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
It seems that the pages that you have on the syllabus don't match my book. Is that because I have a different edition, or?
Yeah, I put the pages of the old edition and I forgot to update with the new edition's pages. So we'll go over that at the end of class every week and try and get the right pages in there. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Alex, good to see you.
This is good. Good coffee.
Hey, Joyous, welcome.
Thank you. Good to see you.
PJ, how are you? The Zoom room is filling up. This is wonderful. Good to see everyone today.
Hi, Joy. I'm good. How are you? Good.
Hello,
Hey, Len,
Hello.
welcome.
just to let you know, I'm sitting in President Garfield's living room.
Good. Enjoy.
How is he? Say hello to me for me.
Very quiet nowadays. I don't understand it.
I'm going to ask everybody as they get in to now put themselves on mute, and Ezra's going to start us off with our opening song.
Yeah, so our opening song today it's called It's Chaim Hi, Tree of Life, and I'm going to real quick share my screen so you can all see the lyrics. And this song is often sung in my experience in Torah services, and it is about how the Torah is the tree of life for the Jewish people, and you should all be able to see the lyrics now. And the way it goes, again, I invite you, I'm going to sing it through once, and then I invite you to join in with me while you are still muted. So the song goes, Eitz chaim hi lemachzikim ba v'tomhecha me'ushar. Eitz chaim hi lemachzikim ba v'tomhecha me'ushar. It is a tree of life for them that hold fast to it, and all of its supporters are happy. It is a tree of life. And I'll loop through that again. Eitz chaim hi lemachzikim ba v'tomhecha me'ushar. Eitz chaim hi lemachzikim ba v'tomhecha me'ushar. It is a tree of life for them that hold fast to it, and all of its supporters are happy. It is a tree of life to them that hold fast to it, and all of its supporters are happy.
Thank you, Ezra. So good to see everyone today. And as you land into this space, we're seeing some new faces who are joining us for the first time this week. Michael Amarola, so good to see you both. Hey, Jennifer. Hey, Jade. Welcome. Okay. So if we had a chance to really spend an extra 15 minutes and really check in with each one of you about your week, we would do that, but we're a bit pressed for time. So I want to do this in the chat function. If you could go to the chat bar and type one sentence about what is new or good for you this week. Something that is either new or good, doesn't have to be, it could be one or the other. But type a sentence and let's check in by chat. Let us know what is new or good. I'll do this. So while you're adding that in the chat, I will just add my new or good out loud. We did a very fun Tu B'Shvat service on Friday night with the Temple Best, and it was just a lot of fun to celebrate trees and drink some wine and juice and eat some yummy fruits. And terrific. I guess the other big is we are now planning to come together in person for those of us who are feeling comfortable enough to come in person next Sunday. We'll be talking about the logistics of that at the end. But as you probably saw in some of our emails this week, we are going to begin in service on Saturday morning for Torah study. And then on Sunday afternoon, we'll be in person. And as well as anyone who wants to come and be participating via Zoom, we will be able to do that as well. So for both of those, we'll have a Zoom component. And so I'm very excited about beginning to see people back in person. It's been a while and I miss everybody. Okay, Ezra, if you could read some of the new and goods in the chat, that would be terrific. Ezra, are you frozen? Oh, you got it, okay.
Sorry, Zoom froze for a second, but here we are. Some new and goods in the chat. My new puppy didn't have any accidents this week, someone says. Someone got to spend time with family from out of town. Someone is COVID negative after a scare. Someone traveled to the West Coast, spent some time with grandparents, went skiing. Someone is glad that there's less snow. Someone is glad that they cleared their driveway from the snow. And today is someone's mother's 87th birthday.
That's terrific.
Wow.
Okay. So good to have everyone joining us. It's a nice full group this morning. I'm sure we'll get a few more folks coming in afterwards as well. Today's topic is an expansion on last week's conversation where we talked about the 5 books of Moses. And today we're going to be talking about the entire Hebrew Bible. And so let me just get my copy down here. The fancy Hebrew word that we use is Tanakh, and that is an acronym. We'll get into the acronym and what it stands for soon. But what I really want to get started with is the idea that when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, Christians call that the Old Testament. And that's fine. I just don't use that language because I don't think that there is a New Testament that is better than the Old Testament. I want to say there's a Hebrew Bible and a Christian Bible, and I happen to be a follower of the Hebrew Bible. And so the language I want to add is very specific about this kind of successionist theology. It can be very prominent in Christian circles. That being said, last week we talked about the 5 books of Moses and how that is our reading strategy each week. On Friday nights or Saturday mornings, we get some wisdom from reading some of the Hebrew Bible, and we do some study of that specific section together. This week, we're going to look at the other books of the Hebrew Bible. And I just want to check my notes real quick. I'm going to ask Ezra now to kind of share a couple different Amazon links for you, because these are 3 books that are just resources, references. None of them are necessary, but if you're adding to your Jewish library, they're all worthwhile. So Ezra, if you could bring up the first one for us. This is the Jewish Study Bible. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the Tanakh that I was holding. So let's talk about this for a second. This book is, someone's got the, Jody, go ahead and mute yourself. We're getting some feedback on your end. So this book is the Hebrew and English of the Bible. And I use it alongside my others just to have the Hebrew text there. The student edition that Ezra is sharing with you is an edition that is very rugged and durable and will last you for decades. So if that is something that is meaningful to you, that is a terrific book. Ezra, if you could now go to the first one, which is the Study Bible, that would be great. Oh, who wrote the Bible? Let's talk about the Jewish Study Bible first. This is something we actually have a copy of at TBS. We purchased this for our prophets class this fall. And basically it is the English only version of the book I just showed you, with amazing commentary and amazing introductory essays written for everyday people to understand each of the different 24 books of the Hebrew Bible. We, Lori can talk about this at the end. We've got about 10 extra copies at Temple Beth Shalom, and we're going to be selling this at a discounted price, at this $25 price is where we're going to be selling it. If you want to get it from us, if you want to order it from Amazon, that's also fine. Again, optional. These are not required books. They're just great resources as we're talking about the Hebrew Bible and how to kind of own it, right? We are the people of the book. Ezra, if you could do that third one now, which is Who Wrote the Bible. This is a book by Richard Elliott Friedman. And this goes to the idea, as I mentioned last week, that liberal Jews do not believe the Bible is God's word, right? Moses did not dictate the Bible. God did not dictate the Bible to Moses on Mount Sinai. And that's what we're reading when we read the Bible. We're reading a human document. So Richard Elliott Friedman is a Bible scholar. He spent a long time in San Diego, and now I believe he's in Atlanta. And he's asking, from the lens of history, who are the different the writers of these texts, and how can we know, A, who they could have been, and B, when would they write? More importantly, I'll be going into this idea a little bit deeper. And so this is called documentary hypothesis, like the theory of who wrote the Bible. And as we dive into that, if that idea is interesting to you, this is a very easy read. It's a very quick, good book about the academic research about the documentary hypothesis about who wrote the Bible, and just a very good resource. All these terrific resources for your library. Okay, Ezra, if you could stop the share screen and now call up our Pinterest image. I want to kind of walk us through this acronym called Tanakh. We said last week that the 5 books of Moses is Torah, and now we're going to look at the idea of not just the 5 books of Moses, but the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the Tanakh, and that becomes an acronym. So here on Pinterest, we have across the top in Hebrew and in English, it says Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And there we get Torah, translated as teaching, Nevi'im, prophets, and then below that, Ketuvim, the writings. This is the acronym, and these are the 24 books that are included in the Hebrew Bible. The other thing I want to tell you as you're looking at these books is the different ways that Jewish communities use these books. So as I mentioned last week, the 5 books of Moses is our primary curriculum, right? Every Jewish community is on a curriculum of reading through the 5 books of Moses each and every week that we go. Right now we're in the middle of Exodus. We're making our way through. In a couple of weeks, we'll be ending Exodus and getting to Leviticus and so on. Alongside those Shabbat readings, there's an additional reading on Saturday mornings in traditional synagogues called the Haftorah reading. And the Haftorah reading comes from the prophets. So you'll see in the former prophets, we've got Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. And then we've got 3 latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. This is the overwhelming majority of where those Haftorah texts come from. I am teaching on Saturday mornings a really fun class at Temple Beth Shalom that any one of you who want to join in can. And we're looking at the prophets in a more academic approach. So in the fall, we looked at Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. And now we are making our way slowly through the book of Kings. We're up to King Solomon. And pretty soon after Solomon, we'll go to Elijah, and then we'll spend a little bit of time in the spring with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. If you would like to join us on Saturday mornings, I will add those links in when I send out emails. You can also go to tbshudson.org and see the announcements each week. But this prophets class is kind of like the second curricular goal for the Hebrew Bible. The third and final curricular goal that many Jews encounter when they study the Hebrew Bible comes from the book of writings. And this is going to be a 2-part answer. The first part is the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is what we sing from in our services, both on Friday night and Saturday morning and throughout the week as well. And then further down below Psalms, you'll see 5 books that I'll highlight here: Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. These 5 books are called the Chamesh Megillot, the 5 scrolls that we read on Jewish holidays. They're our study texts to give us deeper wisdom for how we can understand the holidays through a more beautiful lens. So the Song of Songs is our text for Passover. Ruth is our text for Shavuot in May or June. Lamentations is our sad cry that we read in July at Tisha B'Av. Ecclesiastes is for Sukkot in the fall. And Esther is the next book we're going to be reading. That is the book for Purim. And so we'll actually be doing some Esther study in that Torah study group as we hit March. Okay, so Ezra, if you could ditch the share screen and we can come back together. Any questions about the Hebrew Bible, this Tanakh stuff? Len, quick one, go ahead.
There we go. I just want to express my amazement from 20 years ago. I took 4 years of Sunday school in my synagogue in the Bronx, and 4 years followed that of Hebrew school. And 20 years ago, my son's former girlfriend, the daughter of a Baptist minister who insisted that Daniel would go to hell because he's Jewish, but she informed me of all the other books as being part of the Bible. I thought it was just the Torah was the entire Bible. I knew about the prophets, I knew about Esther, I knew about all the rest of the things, didn't connect them as being part of the Bible. And I thought it was strange to learn that at such a late time.
Yeah, so, it's a lovely idea that we kind of overemphasize the Torah, right? That's just a Jewish stereotype. And I think it's not an unfair one, that the Torah is so primary. It's why it had its own session, right? We spent an entire session last week on the Torah. But now that we have this more expanded session today, what I'm trying to do is put it in context. So to say that Torah is still the primary curricular goal is true. These are secondary goals, the prophetic literature, the book of writings, they're additional. And so I would say if there's one book you fall in love with, it should be the 5 books of Moses, right? That should be the book we should all, reread every year for the rest of our lives. And that would be inexhaustible just to study that. Lori, go ahead.
I was amazed in doing the little bit of reading this week that in the Who Wrote the Bible section, he's intimating that there was a woman who was involved in the writings because they were more about feelings and expressions. And that was his hypothesis. And I wondered if you found that surprising.
It's a nice theory. We just don't know if it's true, but we do know that there are a couple books that we read at the holidays, the Book of Esther, the Book of Ruth, and Song of Songs, that could potentially be written from a woman's perspective, if not from a woman's hand. We just don't know. What we do know is that we learn more about women's roles, women's voices, and women's perspectives in those 3 books than in the other 21. So there is a certain logic there. I think the idea of a woman having a voice in the beautiful book called Song of Songs makes sense. I don't think a woman only wrote that, but I think it could be 2 writers, a male and a female voice that are kind of writing together. It's a love poem, right? It's 2 lovers who are courting each other. And if I was going to write a love poem about, not just one poem, but a series of poems, it might be best practice to have my lover also writing her thoughts about those poems. And so from that perspective, I think the theory is intriguing. I haven't heard anyone kind of like argue it away. You should know Orthodox Jews don't read the Song of Songs as a literal love poem. They read it as God's love for Israel. It's cute. I would prefer it read as a love poem. That's my bias. But yeah, Laura, I think from that specific feminist lens, it really allows us to think differently about how many male voices we are burdened with, and when can we discover a female voice. And so that's kind of one of the reasons I highlight those 3 books from the writings. Any other quick questions about the Hebrew Bible stuff that we just went over? Alex, go ahead.
The Hebrew Bible is the basis for Judaism, but Moses was Jewish. What, if anything, was before the Bible that they were basing their belief on before that?
That's great. Yeah, that's a lovely question. So what we now know, Alex, is that many of the stories that comprise the Hebrew Bible are also found in other texts. So in Babylonia, for instance, we have a similar flood story. We think the Noah story is like unique to the Hebrew Bible, not unique whatsoever. This flood story is a Babylonian myth. And so what we can say from this question is we're borrowing some of these Babylonian ideas to help set up the book of Genesis. And in the book of Exodus, we're certainly borrowing some Egyptian ideas to help with this. The architecture of Moses's portable sanctuary is Egyptian architecture. So what we can say from this, Alex, is from an anthropological lens, what the Jews are doing throughout the Hebrew Bible is called syncretism. They're borrowing from cultures, taking some Babylonian ideas, some Egyptian ideas, and putting a Jewish spin on them. What I try and do is unique to the Hebrew Bible in these texts that doesn't appear in the Babylonian text or the Egyptian text or another text. It's a great question. Other quick questions as we're in this overview of the Hebrew Bible? Okay. Then what I'd like to do now is do a very quick walk through what is called the documentary hypothesis or biblical criticism. This is an academic theory. It first gets developed about 200 years ago by Christian Bible scholars in Germany. And what these Christian Bible scholars develop is the idea of the name for God in Genesis is different from the name of God in Exodus. Why would the main character of the Bible have two different names? Sense. And so what they began to develop is the idea or the theory that in the Genesis text, God is called Elohim, and in the Exodus text, God is called Adonai. So they say, well, maybe there are two schools of writers, the Elohim writers and the Adonai writers. And the academic shorthand for this is E was for Elohim, and J, the letter J, is for the Yud He Vav He or Adonai writers. And that every time we see God's name being used as Elohim, it's coming from the E school. And every time we see the term Adonai or Lord, that's coming from the J school. And so they began to separate the first two books of the Hebrew Bible to say, what does the text look like when we separate the J text from the E text? And they realized that once they did that, the stories still made sense. You could begin to see how the stories, they might have had a little bit less impact, but they were still logical stories. And so what they began to develop over the past 200 years is this theory that there's actually four historical layers of groups of writers coming together to edit and then redact the Hebrew Bible. And so the J and E are the two of the oldest ones for the Genesis and Exodus texts. The book of Leviticus gets the letter P for the priestly school of writers. And then that gets delineated out to say that the first half is from the P school, the second half is from the H school or the holiness school. And then the book of Deuteronomy becomes the last group, and it's its own text written at a much later date. What we can begin to say is, if you think of the Hebrew Bible as written as four different texts, with four different ideas about God, with four different law codes, four different approaches to telling the story, all of a sudden, from a perspective of literary criticism, that makes sense. Oh my gosh, the God of Genesis has one-on-one relationships with all the individual characters. The God of Exodus talks to everybody. Completely different. Genesis chapter 1, God creates in 6 days the world. And when God creates the world, God creates Adam and Eve together as the first non-binary individual. That non-binary individual has the breath of life blown into his nostrils to allow that being to become alive. But in the second chapter of the Hebrew Bible, where God's name is completely different, right? You've got the E and the J school are already arguing in the first two chapters. In the second chapter, God does not speak, God speaks Adam in chapter 1 into existence. God blows the breath of life into chapter 2 of Adam. So we've got two completely different Adam stories, two completely different Eve stories. We then can even say we've got two different Noah stories. Oh my, yeah, there's part of Noah where all the animals go 2 by 2. And then the second part of Noah, they go 7 by 7. The Noah story is supposed to go for 40 days, except it also goes for a year. And so we've got these interesting conundrums that if we separate them out as two different reading strategies that are getting conflated, they begin to make more sense. And so what we can begin to say is that this is a very, very interesting approach to how the Bible could have been written, right? This is Richard Elliott Friedman's theory in his Who Wrote the Bible book. And then what it also allows us to do is to focus in on the idea that what God meant to one writer might have been different to the second, to the third, and to the fourth. So then if we layer these 4 writing schools in historical likelihood of when they probably wrote their text because of the Hebrew grammar, because of what we know from archaeology and other ideas, we can begin to actually date these 4 texts relatively well. And we're going to do that now. So Ezra, if you could open up the doc where we can look at this quick walkthrough of First Temple Israel. And what we have in this document is the timeline is on the left column, and the main events in the Hebrew Bible are in the center column. And on the right column, I've added in the likely text that could have been written at these times. Okay. So let's just kind of move through this together. The first thing you need to know when you see this timeline is I'm dating the time of Jesus's death at 0. That's 2,000 years ago. So when you see something is 1,000 years BCE or 1,800 years BCE, that's before the Common Era. So when I'm referring to this first entry, that's 18th century BCE, before the Common Era, 3,800 years ago. So I just want to make sure everyone is making sense of where we are with these BCE ideas. The first line is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, 18th to 14th century. We have no historical documentation about these guys beyond a cave drawing in the Judean wilderness, but we have no archaeological proof that they ever lived. You know, if we're trying to like figure out, so what do we know? The right column is kind of like the what do we know column. We do think in the 14th and 15th century, there's a sojourn to Egypt. We know that from archaeology elsewhere. And the 13th century BCE is probably the time of Moses. This is also the time of Ramses II. This is also the time of early ancient Hebrew poetry. So the Song of the Sea, the Song of Deborah, the blessing at the end of the Hebrew Bible that Moses gives. These are probably dated to about this time, meaning 3,200 years ago, which is its own interesting idea that the most ancient aspects of the Hebrew Bible are our poetry. The poetry kind of freezes the language, and we kind of see from the grammatical clues in the poetry that there's a kind of an ancientness that the language doesn't preserve when we do some narrative writing a few hundred years later. You'll see after Moses, we then get to the settlement in Canaan. And then after that, this is the more important part. This is the United Kingdom of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. This is about 1000 BCE. And as we begin to scroll up, we can see that this is also about the time that Genesis and Exodus might have had their first draft being written of. After King Solomon, we can say that some of the wealthy elites, like the kings, had a scroll of Genesis and had a scroll of Exodus. It may not be the completed scroll, but they had probably these 2 origin documents to kind of prove their standing. What we see after in 928 is a really important idea for the ancient Israelites, and an important thing to be aware of. In 928, the kingdom divides. King Solomon has been brutal on his taxation policy with the north. The 10 tribes in the north say, time out, we're done. We're out of here. We're not doing this heavy tax system. We're breaking, and a civil war erupts. For the next 150 years, the north goes and does itself on its own. The south, Jerusalem and the south separate. And we then begin to see texts that are written from a northern perspective and texts that are written from a southern perspective. And that becomes a really interesting way to think about how life develops after the kingdom divides. The reason this is important historically is 150 years later, the northern 10 tribes get wiped out. The Assyrians come in, and it's called the fall of Samaria. They wipe out the 10 tribes. These are the lost tribes of Israel that might get cropped up in Ethiopia or India or or a variety of places. But this idea of, yes, Jody, we can send this chart out so folks can have this for their own notes. We'll send that out later today. At the time of the fall of Samaria, when the Assyrians come in and invade, we also get some prophetic literature for the first time ever. We get the innovation or the new idea that prophetic literature is going to bring hope to the people. Amos, Isaiah, Hosea, Micah begin writing. The first two are writing, Amos and Hosea writing from the northern perspective. Isaiah and Micah are writing from Jerusalem's perspective. They're writing about these same moments in 722. The other thing we can say about this moment in time in history is archaeologically, we know a lot more about what happens to Israel here on down than we know from here on up. So we can begin to verify some of the historical things that are happening to the kings of Israel, to the prophets of Israel, and so on. Okay. After that, we see that King Josiah comes in to reform the country, to try and reunite things. It works for a little bit, and we think that Jeremiah, who is Josiah's prophet, begins to do some of his writing here. He might also either be writing the book of Deuteronomy, or he might have his scribe Baruch begin writing the book of Deuteronomy. That's one of the theories of who writes Deuteronomy. But then we see in 586, the exile, the Babylonian exile, Jerusalem is wiped out, the first temple is destroyed, the Jews are sent out into the diaspora. And what happens next is very, very important to the whole thinking of the formation of the Hebrew Bible and primarily to the Torah. Because in 538, Cyrus, the king of Persia, delivers an edict to the Jews of Persia. He says to them, do you want to go back and build your second temple? I'll pay for it. Here's the deal. You pay me taxes, and we will give you all the supplies you need. You can go back and have the freedom of religion that you want. You just are going to be vassals to us. You're going to pay us taxes for the rest of your lives. They agree. They think this is a godsend that they can go back and to rebuild the temple. So after that moment, we see that the second temple is completed. Some of the Babylonian exiles return to Jerusalem. And then we get kind of the history of the second temple here. The big one that we all kind of pay attention to is the book of Maccabees. And the book of Maccabees comes along in 167. When the temple is desecrated, we see 1 Maccabees is written, and then 3 years later, 164 is the rededication of the temple. This is likely when we get Song of Songs and the completion of the Hebrew Bible. Jesus probably born, and at this point, after with Jesus' birth, we begin to see a move from biblical literature to rabbinic literature. That's for another time. Right? We'll get to that other time in another session about the rabbis and the Hebrew Bible. I just went over a lot of material though, and that's
No
I
kidding.
want to pause our content and open it up because I want to make sure you're following along with the ebb and flow of stuff. So whether we're talking about the biblical criticism now or this timeline, Ezra, if you could stop the share screen, we can open this up a little bit. Okay. Amy, go ahead and see your hand first. Oh, I'm sorry, Amy, you're on mute.
This isn't a content comment. It's just, I would like to be able to take notes about this. And I know you said you would send the chart out. It would be helpful in future if you could send it out first.
Sure.
So we could print it out and then take little notes on your chart
Sure.
rather than trying to write the whole thing.
It's a great thought, Amy, and I can. We don't do a lot of this handouts, but every now and then when we do, I can try and push them out in advance.
That'd be great.
And there, Ezra actually has the link for it if you want to access the document on your own. And Jody, if you wanted to get a copy of that Google, grab Ezra's link that he just they put in the chat for us. Okay. other questions, comments? Len, let me go with Kate first. Kate, go ahead.
So I just want to make sure I'm reading the chart, I'm understanding it correct, right? So if I'm looking at this, like the third column all the way to the right is, explain that to me again, how that is connected.
Yeah,
I think I've got it, but I'm also kind of confused.
Ezra, go ahead and share that one more time, and we can kind of walk through this while folks are having questions about it. It's a fine question. So the left column is the historical dates.
Mhm.
The center column are the biblical events that they're keyed to.
Yeah.
And the right column are the texts that are being written that correspond to these timelines. Does that make
And
sense?
so are they being, do we think they're written at that time, or they're written about that time?
Let me give you an example. So Ezra, if you could scroll down a little bit to perfect. I want to show us now 928, where we column J and later E, Genesis and Exodus are probably written about 928. We think this because Solomon might have needed some origin documents because he's got this huge building project. He's wildly successful, and likely he would have wanted to have these origin stories.
Gotcha.
So if we imagine either at the time of Solomon or perhaps right after Solomon, kings of Israel would have wanted these kinds of stories in their annals. It would make sense that at least these stories get written here. The other point I want to reiterate or kind of make more direct here is we see after 928 and 722, the next line, I spoke about Amos, Isaiah, Hosea, Micah. I also want to say that at that time in 722, we also get the first early of the book of Leviticus. Think about that for a minute. Leviticus isn't around for the first 200 years of the kingdom. There could have been ritual sacrifices that were going on, and certainly there were, but there wasn't a law book dedicated to the rules of the rituals. So what we see around 722 is the beginning or probably the first draft of Leviticus. We know this because we see Ezekiel 100 years later is quoting from Leviticus sources. We know the prophets at the time already have Genesis, Exodus, and perhaps Leviticus on their shelves. So one of the ways to think about this is if we can imagine these different historical characters and what they could have been studying about Israel and the story Israel is telling itself, how do they quote and hyperlink their own text with these stories? It becomes another way to kind of verify what were they using as teachings to influence them. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate
I want to now expand on this last point about the sacrificial system, because that is the weirdest thing about the biblical Israel that we just don't get. So I'm going to ask Ezra to stop the share screen for a moment. And I want to talk about sacrifices for a sec, because this, I think, is going to be a little weird, but perhaps really important. Okay. Modern man doesn't sacrifice animals. We haven't done that for 2,000 years. So when we read about the sacrificial system, it just doesn't make much sense to us. It's the hardest series of stories for us to relate to connect to. And so what I want to think about for a moment is a kind of a metaphor of a community barbecue. Let's say at the end of this class, we're going to have a big community barbecue. And at that community barbecue, we're going to have all of the best foods. So the vegans and vegetarians will bring their fruits and veggies. The meat eaters will bring their meat. The poultry eaters will bring the poultry, the fish eaters, right? Everyone will bring their favorite foods. And then we'll set up this amazing barbecue and we will feast together. That is a really interesting way to enter into a thought about the sacrificial system, because in the time of the Hebrew Bible, at least for the first 400 years, you didn't eat meat every day. You didn't have a refrigerator. You couldn't eat meat every day. you likely only ate meat 3 times a year. At Passover, at Shavuot, and Sukkot. Those were the 3 times when the farmers left their farms, traveled to Jerusalem for their week-long feasts, had their community barbecue, celebrated this whole God stuff, and then came home. Oh, we weren't meat eaters. We were primarily vegetarian. That makes a lot of sense as well. Point 1. Point 2, we know in the book of Deuteronomy, they expand the sacrificial system and the community barbecue part of that to say, hey, us farmers in Haifa, in Jaffa, in Beersheba, we want to have more meat in our diet. We like this meat thing. Can we have more than just 3 times a year? Can we do some local sacrificing? And so what we see in Deuteronomy is a revision of the law code, the food laws, to say, okay, you guys in the South and the along the coast, you can have some meat meals. You can do your own local sacrifices for the sake of eating meat. And so one thing we have a hard time thinking about is what was the purpose of this sacrificial system? It seems that the sacrificial system was primarily there to attract God's attention, that God liked the scent of the meat cooking on the barbecue, so to speak, and that when God would smell that scent, God would come close. The term sacrifice in Hebrew is called korban, the thing that brings us close to God. So if I am there to celebrate a fall harvest and I want to get close to God to express my gratitude, I offer up a sacrifice. If I've made a mistake and I've somehow wronged my neighbor and I want to apologize for that mistake, I offer up a different kind of sacrifice. And we see in the book of Leviticus, there are 5 different types of sacrifices. One's a community barbecue, 2 are for mistakes, 1 is for gratitude, and another one is completely all burned up thing. We're not quite sure what that one is for. What this means is, hang on, Len, we'll get to your, think about your question. I'll get there in a minute. I want to finish my thought. For 1,000 years, the spiritual technology of the Israelites was to come close to God through the sacrificial system. We do know one other thing that they used during this time to feel close to God, and it wasn't prayer. It was fasting. When they felt like they were somehow not being seen by God, when they were angry at God or sad because of drought or floods, they would fast. They would deny themselves the sustenance of the land. So from a very kind of primal environment, both the sacrificial system and the system of fasting gives us a lot of really interesting information about how they were relating to the God of Israel, and that the God of Israel likely showed God's self by blessing the land, right? The land becomes the land of milk and honey. We do the right thing. God responds to us by blessing the land and making our crops and our land more nourishing and more fruitful. Okay. Len, now I can open up to your question. Go ahead.
Okay, you've been talking about sacrifices. You were talking about a community barbecue. And I'm curious about people. You didn't mention leg of Len, that's me, but we have Abraham and Isaac. Isaac is supposed to be sacrificed. Is it a test it mentions in chapter 5, or is it something else going on? And I'm curious, did Jews sacrifice people at some time? And if they did, when did it stop?
So the likelihood of this question, Len, is that likely the Abraham and Isaac story is a polemic against child sacrifice. If we think about the sacrificial system, though, what we can say is all of Israelites' neighbors, the Canaanites, the Hittites, were sacrificing their first fruits, not only their oranges and apples, but their first children. Oh, we're going to move from our first child to sacrificing our first goat or first cow or first. It's a dramatic replacement, but I think the sacrificial system stands as a replacement in argument against child sacrifice. That's from, I think, a very specific historical point. We do know that there were probably random people that continued to try and do child sacrifice. We have two other stories besides the Isaac story later on that make reference to child sacrifice. So we can't say it gets completely wiped out. We can say it gets probably minimized to a great extent.
So Jews did do it for a while, or not?
We don't know.
Oh.
We don't have, so what we do know, Leonard, what we do know is we have the bones from the sacrificial altar sites. We do know the kinds of animals that were sacrificed in those altar sites. We don't see human bones. We don't see pig bones. We see sheep and goats.
I'm glad you mentioned pig bones, because it makes me wonder with the advent of pig organ replacements for people, whether or not Jews can have pig hearts.
Yeah, you're skipping 3,000 years.
Yeah.
We're still back in First
I
Temple
jump.
Israel. Okay. Let me say another word about the sacrificial system, because this will serve as a preview to where we wind up going in future weeks with the rabbis. Once the sacrificial system at the time of Jesus fails, because the second temple will be destroyed a few decades after Jesus dies, the rabbis are in an existential conundrum. They can no longer go back to Jerusalem to sacrifice. And they will use the sacrificial system as a model, a base to think about the system of prayer. Technology will no longer be the sacrificial system. It will be prayer, completely replace the sacrificial system. So knowing about its in biblical Israel also begins for us to think about how we can engage our prayer life as this central aspect of our spirituality as well. Okay. We're not going to dive into prayer at all today. We can come back to prayer later on, but just to know that that's kind of like to whet our appetites to move from one technology to the next, but we're still in the sacrificial system. Amy, go ahead.
I'm just a little confused. All of this discussion about sacrifice, where were you placing that in this timeline?
Throughout
Throughout the whole,
from the United Monarchy all the way until the end, it was a sacrificial system. 1,000 years of sacrifices. It's a lot of sacrifice.
thank you.
Okay. Other questions, comments about the JEPD stuff or about the timeline as you're thinking about it? Steve, go ahead.
And maybe it's in the Who Wrote the Bible that I haven't read yet.
Yeah.
What do we know about, particularly in the first two books, how literate were people? How literate were the people that you had the scribes, and then you had the people that were telling them what to write? And we know from like illuminated texts from the Christians, the scribes kind of did what they wanted at times.
Yeah, so let's talk about literature, or what people could read, or who read and who didn't read. What we can honestly say for the first 1,000 years is most read anything. They were never trained. The very rich and wealthy, the elites, the nobles, probably had some leisure time to learn how to read and write. And we kind of see that as they evolve Hebrew grammar and Hebrew literature along that. Likely that was done for the nobility, point one. Point two, all of the texts of the Hebrew Bible were originally delivered orally. So I want to have you think about education for a minute. 3,000 years ago, if you were going to school, you had to memorize what you were going to learn. If you were going to learn the story of Noah, for instance, you had to memorize the story of Noah. The way you memorized the Noah story was to sing it as a song. Oh, okay, that's not so hard. So it could be one of your homework assignments as a school kid was to memorize the Noah story. And maybe Lori, one of your assignments was to memorize the coming out of Egypt story. And when we would get together in community, we'd say, hey, Steve, sing us that song about Noah. And you would get up there, you would have memorized it. That would be your big task in communal life. And Lori would be the one who would sing for us the story of coming out of Egypt. We were orally training ourselves to remember large blocks of text. We also know that in many of the long poems, there are these little tricks of ways to remember blocks of text. First, they're twinned, they're paired. Every poem has a series of pairs on it. So you could begin to say, oh, you're in the first half of the first line, the second half of the second line. You knew where you were. So there was easy construction of these poems to remember the order of things. But the other thing is we weren't reading the text, we were singing the text, or we were having the text better said as being sung to us. So it could be that, Steve, when you were singing us your Noah story, we were gathered at the city gates, and we might have put you up on a raised platform to sing out to 50 or 100 people gathered there to hear the song, and that could be the way that happened. What we do know from the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, that is about 500 BCE. So when they come to rebuild the second temple, in Ezra and Nehemiah's story, what both scribes refer to is the idea of how public readings of the Torah, that on Monday and Thursday, those are market days when people would do their grocery shopping. And on Saturday, on Shabbat, would be the 3 times where the reader of the Torah would come and read to the community. But what we also know is by the year 500, we no longer were speaking Hebrew. We were beginning to speak Aramaic. And so we had to translate the Hebrew words into Aramaic. And so Ezra and Nehemiah both referred to a meturgamon, a translator who could take the words and have a translation that gets recited alongside their original reading of the text. So this means that likely we've got a lot of orality, a lot of stories being passed orally, a lot of songs being memorized and passed orally. The other thing I want to make as a point here is when we think about Isaiah, Jeremiah, all those guys as being a little bit crazy, A, they do write in poetry. B, they're singing songs. Each one of those chapters of Isaiah is a different song. And all of a sudden you can think, oh, well, when someone's singing a song, you don't believe every word, right? There's so many metaphors in a song. You're always trying to figure out the poetry and the beauty of the poetry alongside the song. So there's a certain kind of sense of we're listening to this prophet sing their song and we're trying to figure out the message. We may not be trying to decipher each and every poetic metaphor. We might just be trying to figure out, oh, we screwed up and Jeremiah or Isaiah is trying to get us back on track. Yeah, we can do better. We screwed up again. Sorry about that, right? So that could be another way to think about how we would have heard these songs of rebuke or encouragement or love as ways to get us back on track. Okay, Amy, go ahead.
So you're saying this, is there actual evidence for this? Was there musical notation that we know of, or how do we know what you're saying?
Yeah, well, musicologists, ethnomusicologists have looked at your question and tried to figure out a couple different parts of this question. One thing, we don't have musical notation, so that's Middle Eastern music has different scales. It's completely different. What we do have though is when the Torah 1,000 years ago was given its notation marks, finally, what we began to see were the commas and the periods in the sentences. We could see when the words were supposed to be paused, when they were supposed to be run together as an idiom, where the reading strategies would have been implemented to guide the reader or the singer to sing. So what we could assume is that the ancient singers had some of these as well, and therefore we could think of it with some at least reading strategies in place. Additionally, we know that the musicality of the words is much more amplified and present when we hear the Hebrew sung out loud. So I'm in synagogue listening to the poetry of Jeremiah or the Song of the Sea. There's a certain assonance and alliteration inside the Hebrew poetry that one hears when one is listening to it. It doesn't mean there's a rhyming scheme that our Western ear is most accustomed to, because there really isn't those rhyming schemes like iambic pentameter, for instance. It's much more of assonance and alliteration inside and this kind of parallelism. So the musicologists have assumed primarily the idea of most of the music would have been a combination of percussion drums like doumbeks and African drums, alongside lute, lyre, and some of the other instruments that are listed in the Book of Psalms. So we could probably have a variety of stringed instruments and a variety of percussion instruments that were used in Jerusalem for these public ceremonies. And we just don't know what the ancient music might have sounded like, but we can begin to kind of get a sense of the rhythm of the words themselves and how they might have been presented. Okay. Other questions, other comments as we're thinking about this? There's a lot to go through here. Okay. Erin, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a quick question about the translation.
Yeah.
So when did we go from Hebrew to Aramaic, but then we went back to Hebrew? And then
Sort of. Yeah, sort of.
And then, so I guess I don't really understand that. And then also, do we know if anything changed when we went from Hebrew to Aramaic? Because, you know, languages have different meanings between words. And I was just curious if we ever determined if something was like lost in translation, you know what I mean?
For sure. And so what we can, it's a great question about what did we understand about these texts? We probably didn't understand much because biblical Hebrew is very different than rabbinic Hebrew. That's point one. Biblical Hebrew is probably spoken for about 1,000 years, from 3,500 years ago to 2,500 years ago. It is primarily, I would imagine, used as a literary language. Aramaic seems to come along after the Persian exile ends and the Second Temple begins. Aramaic becomes more the language of the land, that a number of peoples are using Aramaic. Persian begins to be influential as well, that some of the Persian loanwords are coming into both ancient Hebrew as well as Aramaic. But when the rabbis are developing rabbinic Hebrew, find some of these grammatical ideas, and most of it have to do with kind of a sense of the consonantal language. So let me kind of make this a little bit simpler. Hebrew, like Arabic, is built on these three-letter consonant words. So for instance, the word shalom has a shin and a lamed and a mem, the three letters. And the verbs in ancient Hebrew and rabbinic Hebrew are all built on these three-letter roots. And so that most of Hebrew is built on these consonant verbs. What happens grammatically is, in the Hebrew Bible, there are only two tenses. There is past tense to describe what already has happened, and there's future tense to describe what could happen after this moment. which means there's no present tense. That might have actually been intentional. If God's name is a form of to be, can't say to be in Hebrew, that could have been like a way to hide God's presence in the text. It's one theory. It's a fascinating theory. The other idea is when the rabbis are developing rabbinic Hebrew, they've got to come up with some kind of present tense grammatical constructs to talk about how am I speaking now, and how can you understand the difference between present tense experiences compared to past or future. So the rabbinic Hebrew really develops this third tense, and that's kind of how we know a little bit of what their understandings were. There are a couple other grammatical issues about ancient biblical Hebrew, about the vav before words. And if we looked in a Torah scroll, we could see many words had a vav before the word. In ancient Hebrew, that vav was called the vav hahipuch, the vav that flipped it from past to future. If you wanted to say not I was going to the store, but I will go to the store, you could use that same past tense was and put a vav in front, and it would flip it to a future tense. That flipping of the vav ends in ancient Hebrew. The rabbis don't keep that going in rabbinic Hebrew. So it's kind of a shift. What we also know is the rabbis were many things, theologians mostly, pacifists, but they were not grammarians. They weren't big on grammar. They could care less about grammatical exactitudes. That study of grammar doesn't happen for another 1,000 years. So it's only like in the last 1,000 years that grammar scholars have taken their approach to the Hebrew Bible and this issue of translation. Therefore, what we can say is when the rabbis are translating the Hebrew from ancient Israel, they've got a pretty good sense, but they might not be exact. But in speaking the same language, at least using these same three-letter consonant roots, they're at least using the same words that are being used by the people. Once you move from Hebrew to Greek or to Latin, you're right, then translation becomes not only a problem, it becomes, oh, what if you made a mistake? Hebrew is such a rich language. It has so many aspects of richness to it that once we translate to Greek and then to Latin, oh my gosh, we might be making mistakes in our translation, because what we can see in the English translation of the Bible, there's a number of times where the translation is just wrong. And then we've got to figure out, why did they get a wrong translation here? That's another story for a later rabbinic time where we're going to argue about translation. But point being is ancient Hebrew, First Temple Hebrew is there. Aramaic becomes the kind of the language of the people during the Second Temple times. Therefore, Jesus and the rabbis are all probably speaking Aramaic. And what they're developing alongside the Aramaic is this rabbinic Hebrew form, which they're using to kind of develop some of their thinking about Hebrew. And it becomes almost a study language, primarily. Rabbinic Hebrew was spoken to a certain extent and was popular for a small period of time, probably a couple hundred, but it didn't have a widespread appeal that reached many different countries outside of Israel for those couple of hundred years. Great question, though. Len, go ahead.
You mentioned that there was a past, there was the future, but there was no present. And that kind of surprises me because, at least for me, I can say I had breakfast, I am eating dinner. I can go as far into the future as saying I plan, which is now, I plan to have breakfast or lunch tomorrow, but I can't say I will have breakfast because who knows?
So in Hebrew, there are a variety of verbs that are called causative and reflective, and there's passive verbs as well. And so there's a variety of language tools to talk about passive voices and imperative voices. So there is a lot of grammatical complements there. What doesn't exist, let me talk about what's missing in biblical Hebrew. So you can be very clear. There's no form of to be, right? There's no is. There's was, there's will be. There's no is. Oh, there's no way to say I am. Even in Hebrew today, and if you're in Jerusalem today, saying I am, that form of be is kind of convoluted just because of the nature of the language. And so if God's name, the Yud He Vav He, is actually a verb, and using the verb to be, because there's no verb to be, maybe God's name becomes that verb to be. So it's a very, it's a really interesting piece of like language development, and what's missing in ancient Hebrew might be actually the thing that's already there. The reason that we don't have to be is it could be that to be could be God's name. We don't know, right? It's a theory. No, it's not based on anything more than theory. But what I want to say, Len, that is more relevant to our understanding of ancient Hebrew is when Hebrew readers look at God's name, they don't see a noun. Take that in for a moment.
I guess it's no stranger than the Japanese having no word for no.
Exactly, right. So when Hebrew readers read God's name, it's not a cup, it's not a table, it's not an object, it's not a nominal idea. It's a verbal idea. God has process of beingness, unfoldingness. All right, that's Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah, the text that we looked at last week. And all of a sudden, when we try and figure out what did the Hebrew Bible mean by using this word God, it might be something very different than when we use that English term that says God, right? God for Christians might be very specific. For Jews, it might be something very completely different. Okay. I want to go back to this this documentary hypothesis thing, this idea that there's literary layers to the Hebrew Bible, and speak about something that can be jarring to some. Lori and I have talked about this at other sessions, about the idea that, the stuff we grew up with is like the Hebrew Bible was the basis for all of Judaism. And if we think that the Exodus story really possibly didn't happen, what does that mean for the story of not only how we understand the Hebrew Bible, but how do we understand God? And so we'll kind of get there in our discussions about theology and Jewish theology. But one thing I want to say about this idea is the God of the Hebrew Bible was never intended to be perfect. Right? Nowhere in the Hebrew Bible does God claim to be perfect. Christian layering on of God needing to be perfect because they want Jesus to be perfect, and if that works for Jesus, that's fine. That's never what the Jewish intention of the idea of Elohim or Adonai was needing to be or supposed to be. And if we think about the character of God as a literary development, if we think about God developing throughout the Hebrew Bible and getting to be a different character in the beginning than God is at the end, we begin to think about God differently. The God of Genesis changes in Exodus. The God of Numbers is not the same God in Deuteronomy. And all of a sudden, this whole layering approach that I've just laid out is a new way, I think, of thinking about God, as God's character shifting and developing over time, and that the Israelites are developing their language and their approach to not only God, but to the rituals and to how they're living their lives. And so to kind of like lay this out for you, in the Hebrew Bible, in the 5 books of Moses, we have 3 law codes, 3 types of laws that are set out. They're somewhat similar, but the Exodus laws that could have been written about the time of King Solomon are very few and very spare. Michael and I were studying these at Hillel with students on Friday night. We were talking about these sets of laws. These laws that were in this week's Torah portion called Mishpatim get enhanced, reformed, developed in the next book called Leviticus. And in the book of Deuteronomy, we get a new or a third set of laws. So all of a sudden, if you're a legal scholar and you're looking at the evolution of Jewish law, you can look at the laws that we read this week in Mishpatim and the laws in Leviticus and then the laws in Deuteronomy as three completely different law codes written at three completely different times. And all of a sudden you go, oh, okay, so now if I want to understand the laws that could have been going on for Solomon, I can read the Exodus laws. If I want to understand the laws that could have been going on for Isaiah, I can read the Leviticus laws. And if I want to understand the laws that are going on for Jeremiah, I could read the Deuteronomy laws. And all of a sudden, we begin to see in this sample, oh, the laws are shifting and changing and evolving, just like Israel in First Temple times is shifting and changing and evolving. And that is like another way to think about not just Judaism as a singular, but Judaisms. And that at no time was Judaism a fixed, defined thing. It's always been a developing, progressing, evolving religious civilization, which is another thing that we'll return to over and over again as we think about the complexity of ancient Israel, that we like to keep things really simple. But whenever we do that, we realize we're losing out some of the richness. I want to add one more point before we, Amy, before you hold on to your question. I want to come to questions in a minute. I want to add one more point about the voices in the Hebrew Bible. The primary voice of Moses is kind of like the prophet of the book, right? That's like the primary voice. Alongside Moses's voice, we also have the voice of the priest, his brother Aaron. So for much of the 5 books of Moses, we have the model of 2 leaders, a prophet and a priest. When we get to the voice of King David and then King Solomon, we then get a new leadership model. We then get a king alongside the prophet and the priest. And all 3 voices are kind of vying for power. Who's got the power to say what goes? Likely it's going to be the king. And so the prophet and priest are now, from that moment on, diminished to a certain extent. Alongside the voices of the prophets, the priests, and the kings, the book of Psalms gives us a 4th voice. It's the voice of everyday folks who are singing their songs and celebrating Passover and Shabbat and the harvest and good times and bad times. And so sometimes when we're looking for the everyday voice in the Hebrew Bible, it's easier to discover that everyday voice in the book of Psalms than it is when we're talking about these elites vying for power. Because if we're just harvesting our crops, we could actually care less about the politics of Jerusalem. We might really care, though, that, oh, there's a drought. We need more water. What are we going to do? Oh, my God. Do we cry to God? Do we sing to God? I don't know. Right? And all of a sudden, the voice of Psalms becomes that voice of the everyday folks, of the singers who are trying to make sense of Israelite culture in a way that makes sense to them in a more mundane, everyday experience. Okay, now I'm going to go back because I saw Amy's hand before I launched into that whole thing of the prophets and the priests. Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, so this idea of the developing concept of God, to me, suggests that God is a creation of man, rather than the other way around. And that what you have is that over time, people are forming an understanding of what God might be, and that's a changing idea that they put into writing and use then as a framework for for social functioning. for social and spiritual functioning.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think that really rings true to me. And I think therefore, not only is the development of God a human development, but that we can say two more things, that the development of the Israelite culture and religion is a human development, right? That develops alongside the texts and the practices. The other thing that seems to develop is we can see that at different moments in the text, our relationship to God changes. It seems to be that throughout the first temple, the way you invoke God's presence in your life is to verbalize God's name. It's called a Shem theology, that if you could somehow utter God's name, you could somehow connect to that God idea, especially if you're going to offer up your sacrifices. What is very different, though, is the story of God in Exodus is God being very intimate with the people, God around to kind of converse with Moses on a regular basis. What we don't always see, though, is that by the time of Samuel and David and Solomon, his son, there's a real distancing with God and the Israelites' relationship to God. God is no longer in their everyday affairs so much. God seems to be distant and far apart, perhaps higher up as well. Right? So there's a lot of, I think, structure to both the intimacy of God that we experience perhaps in Exodus and the distancing that we see of God throughout the prophets. And then we get the prophets who claim to have these divine experiences, or trying to bring us back and close that gap from heaven down to our realm. Len, I saw a hand, go ahead.
You seem to be saying that the relationship of people to God develops, but I found two phrases from Amy interesting, and I wonder about them. Did God invent people, or did people invent God? And one sounds like a rationalization, and the other one's an article of faith, and who knows?
Yeah. Exactly, right? And you know, if we think about the writer of the book of Genesis, holding that question, right? The writer of the book of Genesis in the first chapter says God creates human in God's image. And so the writer at some moment is trying to figure out your question and say, well, maybe the things are happening simultaneously. We're not sure. It's a great question. And what that also means, though, is to have a certain amount of humility about God language, right? That we're not talking about a God that we are devoted to. We're talking about a God that develops in its relationship to Israel. And then what will the rabbis will do with all of this God stuff is really going to be phenomenal. Right? They're going to reject all of the Hebrew Bible's God ideas and run with a brand new series of metaphors for God, because they now need a God that's going to somehow listen to their prayers, and they have a whole prayer stuff. So we'll develop this theological approach to God as we get to the rabbis, because it will shift. The ancient biblical ideas of God in the text are interesting and meaningful. The rabbis pretty much reject all of it, and they go with a variety of new metaphors for how they're going to connect to God. Okay. Let's see, other questions about, we've touched on a lot of different topics. And I wanted to make sure that we're kind of nailing your main questions. Any other comments or questions as we wrap this up today? Because we've hit on a lot. Okay. Amy, I saw a hand go up, and I wanted to see if you had another question for us.
Well, I didn't want to hog the time, but since nobody else is saying anything, I guess to me, not only does the concept of God change within Judaism over time, within the Bible, under this hypothesis that you're talking about, but also you kind of alluding to the fact that it changes again later in the oral rabbinical tradition that develops later on. But to me, when we look at the world isn't all Jews, right? The world is Christians and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and all of that. And every people has had a way of shaping their idea of that which is larger than us, whatever that is. And obviously nobody's got a lock on this. Because really, if God, was going to insist, if God is there, this is a spiritual point, I guess, that I'm making. If God is there in actuality and has as a requirement for acceptance of us that we get it right, then of the 8-some billion people on earth, 799,999,999,000 of them are wrong. And there's going to be one person up there in heaven with God, because everybody has a different idea about it.
From that global perspective, you're right. And when we get to our session on theology, we'll develop 3 different ways of thinking about God through the lens of mystical, rational, and secular ideas about God. And we'll develop that perhaps better in that session than we can here on ancient Israel. But yes, I would say, Amy, in short, we all do. And so the way I think about your point in this kind of a group is when I'm talking to Christians and Muslims, I don't think their ideas of God are any different than mine or any less holy than mine. So my question to them isn't about which one's right and which one's wrong. I could actually care less about that. What I want to know is how they get up the mountaintop, and how do I get up the mountaintop? So if I can talk to them about their spiritual practices that get them through their hard times and their good times, and I can share my spiritual practices that work for me, all of a sudden we're having a very different conversation, not about who's right and who's wrong, but how are you getting higher up? And that's a much more interesting question to me than the question of right or wrong.
So I guess that's what I'm saying, that this whole hypothesis says to me that people create an image of God that allows them to direct their behavior in their life, in their lifetime, to figure out what they should do with their time on earth.
And so therefore, from this more academic, distant perspective, we can imagine why this group of people living on the edge of the desert need a God that's going to make sure there's enough rain there, that there's enough water to water their lands, that there's enough sustenance to survive. And so we can begin to think of like how these different theological perspectives develop, because what happened in Babylonia was they destroyed the crops, they overfarmed. And so they had to have a different environmental answer than just farming the land to exhaustion, because that failed in Babylonia. And so from that perhaps agricultural approach, we can see that they had a whole different agenda on hand. Jody, go ahead.
Well, I have 2 questions. One's really simple. Did I understand you to say that the order of the expansion of characters was Moses, David, and Solomon, or Psalms?
You got to ask the question differently, because I'm not understanding the question.
Well, you said that in the beginning, there was the voice of Moses, the prophet, and Aaron, the priest.
Then I got it. Yeah. So let me restate that. That at the time of King David and King Solomon, the theology is no longer the theology of intimacy that Moses experienced as the prophet. It was that both Solomon and David were not prophets, they were kings. They employed prophets. We knew that they had a prophet in their court, but they employed a different theological approach to access God, which is called the Shem theology. S-H-E-M is the Hebrew word for name. They invoke God's name, and that invocation of God's name was the way to attract God's attention. When God is more distant, you you need to call God up and say, hey, God, we need to check in. Can you come down from heaven and hang out with us for a few minutes?
So both David and Solomon did that.
Right.
Correct. When was the voice of the people added?
The voice of the people is the book of Psalms. So Tehillim, or Psalms, is what I would say sits alongside the voice of the kings, the prophets, and the priests. That the voice of Psalms in Hebrew Tehillim, is this fourth voice, the voice of the people.
Then my second question was, is this, I mean, it looks to me as if the expansion of figures or characters in Judaism, just as it is in most religions, is to enhance the status quo of the power structure.
Oh,
In other words, by distancing the people and having them have to go through various intermediaries, it establishes and reaffirms kings,
Yeah.
lords, all that.
so let's talk about this patriarchy, the setup of the patriarchy for a minute. Because what is interesting from your question is how that was different than what happened in Babylonia, which wasn't a patriarchy, it was a matriarchy. So what we can say about the Hebrew Bible and biblical times is the revolution is to reject the matriarchy and choose a patriarchy instead. And that is a fascinating shift. And it means that women's voices are being shifted and shunted and diminished. And the men now come up with the answers. The men now come up with the more meaningful obligations and roles and get to be the decision makers. It also will become an interesting counterpoint to what biblical women experience versus rabbinic women. We see in the Hebrew Bible that women, while they're not equal, they still have a voice. We have women as prophets. Miriam and Deborah are two women who are prophetic. We have women permitted to inherit land. We have women who can be tribal leaders. All of that female power that exists in the Hebrew Bible will be stripped away from them at the time of the rabbis, and women will lose complete control. They will no longer get much of anything. So the diminishment of women from the matriarchy of Babylonia to the patriarchy of Israel, biblical Israel, becomes even more dramatic once we get to the rabbis, who will rip all those vestiges of female power away.
But it's also, I mean, aside from that,
Yeah.
isn't it also sort of a class system is evolving?
Right.
Okay.
So this class system will be adopted by the rabbis, and that class system will have its own problematic nature as well. So that's a nice way to think about it. Yeah. I wouldn't say the class system is as rigid as the caste system in India, but there's certainly a class system that develops.
Got it. Thank you.
Len, last one, and we'll wrap this up for today. We'll do some homework stuff after Len's question.
Several times you've mentioned the name of God. And when I grew up, you only used the term Adonai in a prayer. Otherwise, you said Ado Shem. The Orthodox say Hashem, but none of those are the real name of God. So why does it matter which of those three you use at any time?
We'll get there, Len. From the lens of biblical Israel, the name of God, the Yud He Vav He name, was only uttered by the high priest once a year on Yom Kippur. So that special name of God is got a bit of exclusivity to it. We have to be careful with that name. It can invoke problems like we have in Raiders of the Lost Ark when we get kind of random with it. And so what we'll see is how this name of God develops with the rabbis, and how they then create all of these replacements and substitutions to use alongside God's name.
Well,
and how we can develop that.
There's a Christian sect that ends with witnesses in the
Yeah,
first
we're not
part of
there.
that name.
We're
It's just a
still,
full
yeah,
name.
we gotta wait.
Later.
We're not there yet.
Later. Okay.
Yeah, we're still in the Bible right now. Okay, great. Let's talk about the readings for this week. I'm gonna call up the syllabus really quick so that we can take a peek at that. So there it is. I noticed mistakenly that I was using the page numbers from the old book instead of the new book. So I'm calling up our assignment for week 3. Week 3 is the rabbis, rabbinic civilization and Jewish law, Midrash, Mishnah, Talmud, on prayer. And the readings here is chapter, let me, 310 and 314. So let me get the exact readings because I think he might have tweaked that in his new edition. So chapter 13. So chapter 6 is the chapter on the rabbis. That begins on 3:15. And you basically want to read in and around chapter 6 the same headers around rabbinic Judaism. And so I would say if you could skim or find 20 minutes to read the beginnings of chapter 6, that's going to be fine, those opening sections. If you want to kind of bounce through some of the other sections in chapter 6, the main ones are the roots of rabbinic Judaism, what is the Mishnah, and then Midrash at the bottom are the main ones. And then alongside sections of chapter 6, if you could take a peek at chapter 4, 613 ways living a Jewish life, that opening section, those opening 10 pages would be a nice complement to this whole idea of rabbinic law that we're going to be encountering for next week. Now, the other thing to think about is anyone that wants to dive deeper and has more time, more than 15, 20 minutes, they can read more of chapter 6 and more of chapter 4. So if you want to take not just a 15 or 20 minute tour of the readings, you'll have an hour. You can certainly take an hour and go into deeper exploration, primarily of chapter 6 on the rabbis. If you like Jewish law, you can also do a little bit of that in chapter 6 as well. Len, go ahead.
Could you perhaps send an email, not just chapters? I obviously, from the emails I sent you, got very confused because I have a different edition than you were citing. But could you mention chapters and page number ranges that are
sure
signed, and then page numbers for the suggested alternate extra
right
stuff?
So tonight, when Ezra sends out the link, or I send out the link to our YouTube recording, I'll add in the readings as well as what's going to be happening with Temple Beth Shalom this weekend, if you want to join us for this or that. So it'll be a pretty full set of email items in tonight or tomorrow's email with all of these updates. Lori, I saw a hand. Oh, you're on mute. Lori, you're on mute. Go ahead.
I just wanted to be sure you were going to confirm in-person study
right
next weekend, and I will have the books at Temple next week for anyone who wants to purchase one of the 10 that we have.
That's great. That's the Jewish Study Bible that you're referring to. So,
Rabbi, we're coming to your house?
No.
Just joking.
Yeah, we're coming to Temple Beth Shalom if we're comfortable coming in person. So beginning with Saturday mornings, Torah study on the prophets, and then Sunday afternoon for our session on Judaism 101. For those people comfortable to be in person masked, they're welcome to join me. If you're masked and boosted, vaccinated, boosted, and masked, you can join me at TBS. If you want to stay on Zoom, you can do that as well. The other thing I want to say about next Sunday afternoon session is I would like to shift the time gently up 30 minutes and start at 4 p.m. instead of 4:30. That way I can have dinner with my family after I come home from Hudson.
Sure.
So show of hands, who can be there at 4 instead of 4:30 next Sunday? Great. So we'll make that shift and that'll be part of the email as well. Good. Len, I see and Amy, last 2 points. We're running a bit late, so make them
Last
quick.
week you had mentioned 4 o'clock. That's why I got so confused this week. So 4 o'clock is fine. Also, on the Saturday mornings, we're very fortunate. We have a little brunch stuff. Are there snacks on Sunday or we bring our own?
No.
No,
Nope, not yet. Yeah,
Okay.
we, for the time being, we're not eating in person. If you need to snack beforehand or after, but we won't be eating in person.
Is that true Saturday morning too now?
Yeah, yeah.
yes.
Good to know.
For,
Thank you.
for the first several weeks, we'll figure it out as the variant works through. Amy, go ahead.
So sort of on that same theme, are we gonna meet in the social hall so we can
Yes.
have a little more distance
Yep,
if we
yep.
want it?
Yep,
Okay.
yep.
And you'll have
Okay.
the owl, right?
We'll have the owl set up as well for to bring in the Zoom stuff. Okay, everyone, thank you for a very fun and enjoyable session. I really enjoyed it today. And I will see everybody. If anyone wants to ask questions during the week, specifically about the readings, Ezra has created a group chat. If you want to join that group chat, you can kind of ask your questions about the readings or wherever comes up for you during the week. It's another way to keep the conversation going. And I look forward to seeing everybody either next Saturday or next Sunday. So take care.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Aloha. Shalom.
Rabbi, I went to Sam's Club on Saturday. And I have the tables on hold. I'm just confirming someone whose car is big enough to fit. But I'm thinking they had quantity in both the 8-foot and the 6-foot. I'm thinking of of doing an 8-foot, a 6-foot, a 6-foot between, and an 8-foot and a 6-foot on the other side, just because the room isn't that deep
Yeah, yeah.
to go
Makes
that
sense.
far back, okay?
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, do you use your intuition on this one? It sounds
Okay,
fine.
they're $59 and $89, and they have very nice tops. So
Great.
they're the ones we have at Little Tykes, and they work
Great.
they're easy to open and stand and close.
Perfect.
Okay, good.
Okay.
How do you like
Okay.
to be in jail?
Enjoy.
Oh, my God. Glenn, are you
That's down in
okay?
Manchester. That's the one from the Shank Shore Redemption.
Go home, guys. I
Glenn
gotta
is in
talk to
jail.
Ezra and
Bye.
get on to dinner.
Look, he's in jail.
Go, get out of here.